Hi guys, in today's session, I'll be taking through with you the VLAN, which is the very most important topic with regards to what we want to integrate with the network that we've created, with our LAN that we've created. So, let's get into the proceeding of the day. So, a VLAN, which stands for a virtual local area network. So it's a subnetwork which can group together collections of devices on separate physical area networks. So you can group about devices on a separate physical area network, which is your LAN. And also it's a custom network which is created from one or more local area networks, and its function, it enables a group of devices available in multiple networks to be combined into a logical network. So its main purpose is to group or combine these multiple networks into one logical network. So the question after seeing these three pointers would be, actually, what is this guy is talking about? Actually, I can see there is about collection of devices. Are you talking about nodes, the physical local area network on a separate, it combines into logical network? So let's look into that on the next slide. On the next slide, we have we've got our switches, our three switches. We've got basically we've got a network. So let's get into the explanation. So below is a network with three different physical switches. We've got our physical switches that are in place, and then these switches facilitate communication with the networks. So these, they facilitate communication with the networks. We've got two networks in place, and the routers facilitate communication between these network, remember. So if computer A wants to communicate with computer B, how flow of data would go from these switches, and it will go from the network, from switch 2 to the network and up to switch 3 where it locates computer B. Also, let's move on to the next slide. So if each of these switches have 24 ports, if these physical switches have 24 ports, and only two are in use, meaning only two ports are in use. So let's say for instance, on these 24 ports, only two ports on each of these three switches are in use, then 22 ports are left wasted on each switch. Just imagine. So we have only two workstations, computer A, B from this network, computer C, D from this network. So these network only uses two of these switches from these switches, and also these two computers use only two ports. So 22 ports are left wasted. Let's say maybe we've got it's A, B, C, D, and E, F. So we've got about 22 ports left wasted. So what if you want to, let's say for instance, maybe you want to replicate this network elsewhere, you want to have the same network on another building, and you do not have three physical switches to accommodate. Let's say for instance, maybe one of the your clients uh, requires you to, have that same topology. Maybe they like the topology that you've implemented on one of your clients, and they want you to, implement that, and then you figure out that the three uh, 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 they don't have the three physical switches. So how would you accommodate them? So this is where VLAN comes to play. So VLAN, it will allow you to take one physical switch. So you'll take one physical switch, and break it up into smaller mini switches like what I've explained here. It will combine multiple networks into one logical network. So uh, how would the VLAN take one physical switch and break into smaller switches? How? So let's look that into the next slide. So the next slide explains that, for instance, consider each circle 1, 2, 3. So one circle we have allocated into VLAN 10, which is the red circle, and the orange circle is being allocated to VLAN 20, and the last circle, which is the blue circle, is allocated to VLAN 30. So consider each circle on the switch below has its own mini switch. So each of these mini switches or virtual switches, let's rather use this term, correct terminology. Virtual switches operate completely independent from the others, meaning these virtual switches are operate independently. They independent from each other, and exactly as they would had there been three different physical switches. So exactly as they would had there've been three different physical switches, so they operate differently as if there would be three different switches, the same concept, but with this instance it's only one switch divided into three virtual switches. So on to the next client, you can utilize one switch and divide it into three segments. So on to the next slide, it explains further. So each virtual switch or VLAN is simply a number assigned to each switch port. So it's only assigned to a single switch point, and you can only do that on the switch, as we have done so on the project itself, where you had to assign, but in default, when we had your switch mode access, VLAN 1, and so forth and so forth, that's where you assign your switch, your VLAN onto the switch. For example, so the two switch ports in red, the two switch ports in red, these ports, they refer to these ports in red, might be assigned to VLAN 10, and the two ports in an orange mini switch might be assigned to VLAN 20. So these are assigned to VLAN 10, and these switch port are assigned to VLAN 20, and these are assigned to VLAN 30. Remember, we assume that this is a 24 port, so let's be precise in terms of the numbers. How many switch ports does each, how many logical virtual switches does each VLAN has? So we've got about 24 divided by 3. So each VLAN would have 8 ports within it. So we're being precise, we're being exact in terms of the number. So we'll have 8 switch or ports within each VLAN. So VLAN 10 will have 8 ports, VLAN 20 will have 8 ports, and VLAN 30 will have 8 ports. Uh, and lastly, the two switch ports in blue mini might be assigned to VLAN 30. So if a port is not explicitly assigned to a VLAN number, it resides in default VLAN, which has a VLAN number of 1, as we have done it before. Onto our switches, how our switches are configured. Most our VLANs are in default, meaning uh, uh, show int brief. Okay, exit show int brief, exit, show int brief, okay, show VLAN. Yes, perfect. So as you can see, it's only VLAN 1 which is in default, which has about ports that are assigned from port 1 up until to port 24. So that's what they mean in terms of any ports any ports that are not assigned would reside in the default VLAN, which is number 1. So now traffic arriving on a switch port assigned to VLAN 10. So traffic arriving on a switch port assigned to VLAN 10. So traffic, when this PC sends traffic to VLAN 10, it arriving to assigned VLAN 10 will only ever be forwarded out to another switch port that belongs to a VLAN 10. A switch will never allow traffic to cross a VLAN boundary. So traffic that sends to this, let's say maybe on this VLAN we've got PC, which is A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7, A8. Remember, I've got only 8 ports. So traffic will only be forwarded out to that VLAN 10. So only 8 PCs will be communicating to this VLAN. If it happens whether this 8 PC wants to communicate to another VLAN, it will have to communicate over the network in order for them to communicate with these VLANs. So let's look into that. So each VLAN operates as if it were a completely separate physical switch. Also, traffic from the red switch cannot magically appear on the orange switch without first passing through a router, what I've just explained. So each of these PCs from this VLAN cannot pass through or communicate directly with these VLAN without passing through to the network or to the router. So these PC needs to communicate to the router in order for the router to allow them to communicate with these VLANs. Um, Traffic in VLAN 10 cannot magically appear on VLAN 20 without also passing through a router. So ultimately, assigning different ports to different VLANs allows you to reuse a single physical switch for multiple purposes. And also a VLAN allows you to extend the smaller virtual switches across multiple physical switches. So what do they mean by that? So let's look into that in terms of extending virtual switches across multiple physical switches into the next slide. So if we've got two switches that we have and we want to extend something similar that we have from our uh, network diagram. So we've got about, in this it's quite complex. So in this instance we have about three switches and we don't have VLANs assigned to it. So now we want to gather much knowledge in order for us to apply that into our network. So let's look in terms of extending virtual switches across multiple physical switches. Let's move on to the next slide where it explains further in detail. So now notice how VLAN 10 and VLAN 30 have been extended into a second switch. You can see VLAN 10 and VLAN 30 have been extended into second switch. So what does that simply mean? That A and C can communicate within the VLAN. So if this is port 8, A8 and C8 PCs can communicate because of they are in the same VLAN. Similar to B8 because they've got 8 ports, and D8 because of 8 ports, these can communicate because of they're in the same VLAN. So this enables host A and host C to exist in the same LAN despite being connected to different physical switches located in potentially different areas. And the primary benefit of extending a VLAN to different physical switches is that the layer 2 topology no longer has to be tied to the physical topology. So a single VLAN can span across multiple rooms, floors, or office buildings. And also, lastly, each connected switch port in the topology above is a member of a single VLAN. So this is referred to an access point. Let me repeat that. Each connected switch port in the topology above is a member of a single VLAN. So this is referred as an access point. So an access point is a switch port that is a member of one VLAN. So in this video, I've covered in terms of the VLANs and what are the VLANs and the process in terms of how packets are shared and how VLANs, the functionality of a VLAN allows packets to be shared. So in the next video, I will go through in terms of the port trunk and how that also allows us or assist us in terms of the VLANs. So since you have watched this video, I would like you to uh, just play around with by just creating a separate Cisco packet tracer VLAN where you'll have your router, your switch, and if you can have maybe two routers and two switches and maybe one devices, so that you can be able to create create your VLANs like what you have just what like what I've just covered onto this video. So please do that exercise, and in the next video, before I even continue with the trunk, I'll just also just go through an example and of how you create these VLANs, and so that we can have a bigger purpose and apply that onto our main network diagram that we've created. So that's it in terms of today's video. I hope you understand what I've just covered, and please do this exercise where you create a VLAN on another Cisco packet tracer exercise. So please do that, and I'll just catch you up onto the next video. Take care.